All right, good morning. No, good afternoon, everyone, to Lunch and Learn, and good to see you. I don't know what to say. It's just another Thursday. We've been doing this for so long. We have a new staff member, and I was training her this morning and explaining to her what Lunch and Learn is, and it was just beautiful to realize that this is every year. We're going up all the way through December 31st, December 30th, and it's just been such a constant for us. We see everybody every week. So it's good to see you. And we have a wonderful speaker here today, Steve Gimbel. And Steve is a professor of philosophy at Gettysburg College. He's also an affiliate of the Jewish Studies program there and author of 6 books, including Einstein's Jewish Science, Physics and the Intersection of Politics and Religion, and Einstein, His Space and Times in the Yale University Press Jewish Live series. He also has 4 lecture series with the teaching company's great courses, including Redefining Reality, Intellectual Implications of Modern Science, and Take My Course, Please. The Philosophy of Humor. Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Claudia. It's absolutely wonderful to be here with everybody today. We were speaking earlier. I came up and visited you in person. Gosh, it must be about 10 years ago for the JCC's Jewish Book Fair, way back when. It was the year Delia Ephron, I think, was there. I got to meet her. It was one of those things you don't forget. But they contacted me, asked me if I'd be willing to come back and chat with you, and the answer, of course, was yes. And so the question was, could you come up with something different, something a little bit more Jewish, they asked, and the result was this. A conversation we'll have today that I'm calling Amos and Einie, Albert Einstein's Social Political Writings and Prophetic Judaism. So I do work both in philosophy of physics. So people wonder, well, what is that? It sounds impressive. So philosophy of physics looks at the laws of physics and asks, what would the world really look like if these physical theories were true? So physicists just worry about testing things. Philosophers worry about what they mean. So, having been a Jewish science nerd my whole life, one of the people you just have to fall in love with is Albert Einstein. And so part of my professional research has been looking at Einstein's physics. But I'm also a member of the Jewish Studies program here at Gettysburg College. So I teach courses in the history of Jewish thought. And so what I thought we could do today is actually combine the two, is try to understand Einstein in a sort of Jewish context. And what we're going to do is we're going to do that, and this is where the title comes from, by comparing him with the prophet Amos. So let's launch into it. The Tanakh. So as Jews, we all know the Torah. What some may not know is that it's part of a trilogy. So if you look at the sacred texts that we have the Torah, which is clearly the central of these texts, right? It's the one that gives us the halakhic law, the 613 mitzvot that we're supposed to follow, right? It has the history, the creation myth, the story of the Exodus, right? This really is our central sacred text, but it's not the only one. There are 2 other books that are combined with it to form what is generally referred to as the Hebrew Bible. The second of the books, it's sort of a catch-all called the Writings, and this is the one that has a lot of the books that tell stories of sort of post-biblical Judaism. The Book of Ruth, the Book of Esther, the Book of Daniel, right? These are the books that are in this other one, but what we want to talk about today is the third of the books, which is called the Book of Prophets. And it is, as the name indicates, a book that concerns itself with the Hebrew prophets. These were people whose lives were mostly post-biblical, that is, after the period discussed in the Torah. Now, there are some of them who are called the former prophets, who are mentioned in the Torah. These are figures like Elijah, like Joshua, like Samuel. But then there are what are termed the latter prophets, and these are the ones whose lives come after. And we'll do a little bit of history in a bit, but the ones you may have heard of, these are the major figures like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the weirdest of all of them is Ezekiel. That's the sort of new agey one that has all the weird images, animals with 4 faces and circles inside circles. That's the book that a lot of mystics have been fascinated with, trying to understand what the meanings of these visions could have been. But then a major chunk of this book deals with what are called the minor prophets. And that's because they're lesser known or less important, not because they were under 21 and couldn't drink. And yeah, Passover, I guess everybody had the 4 cups. But there are a dozen of these minor prophets. These are lesser known figures who were recognized as prophets. And what we want to do today is focus on one of those minor prophets, Amos. Now, if we're going to talk about prophecy, if we're going to talk about prophets, we have to understand what we mean. Now, the term prophet, as we tend to understand it, is colored by the Christian understanding of what it is to be a prophet. The Hebrew prophets are a very different sort of character. So let's start by setting out the distinctions between classical, traditional Jewish thought, Greek thought, and Christian thought, because Christianity really combines the other two and takes it in its own direction, which colors what we think we mean by words. And if we want to really understand what's happening in our own tradition, what we need to be able to do is sort of separate off what we've inherited from the mainstream culture. So Jewish thought stems from the original structure of the Judaic community. So we began thousands of years ago in the Middle East, in the areas around Jerusalem, where Jewish life really did focus on the temple. Right? We all know of the Western Wall, right? The last remaining remnant of the rebuilt temple, but the temple really was the center of Jewish life. The reason that's so important to us is that it was a building, and we, the Jews, were on the land surrounding it. The thing to understand, what makes Judaism really fascinating in its origins, is that it begins as one of the first agricultural communities. So you were in an area that's largely desert. Farming is not easy. And so most of the people in the area were nomads. You had a few places in the Fertile Crescent where you started to have cities develop. And so what you have in the midst of these very different approaches to being is one of the first communities that decided to settle down and work the land. And that notion of settling down meant that we had to figure out how to live as an agricultural community. So you had the temple, you had the priests, the Kohanes and the Levites, who are, higher ups in the pecking order. You had everyone else working the land. And this is why, if you look at Judaism, the concept of land is central. We talk about Eretz Yisrael or Haaretz, right? The land. Now, to a modern ear, we hear the word land and we tend to think of a region, right? That's because we really have a mindset that is sort of based in nation states, countries. But when we talked about the land of Israel back then, we weren't talking about a country of, we literally meant the land, because that was the most important thing to farmers. Those who are involved in agriculture, their lives revolve around the land, haaretz, right? And so this notion of land becomes so central in Judaism because we really do start as farmers. The question then is, okay, we're doing something different. We're not moving our sheep around. We're going to stay put. Okay, how do we live this life? And so what you get is a tradition that really is law-based, right? Halachic law is not some abstraction. It's a social contract that allows this initial settlement of farmers to figure out how to live together. And so simple things like hospitality seems like it's an abstract moral concept. Well, no, who else is on this land? Well, we're trying to settle down, but there are lots of nomads. Now, these nomads, if they feel threatened by you, will do bad things to your newly erected village. So what should we do in order to keep on good terms with them? Be hospitable, welcome them in, feed them, treat them like us. Because what's going to happen? They're nomads. In a little while, they'll leave. They'll leave us alone. We'll be safe. We'll coexist. So be hospitable to the stranger. Why? Because that's part of what's going to keep this community intact. You have stories like Sodom and Gomorrah. What are they saying? They're saying, okay, stay here on the land, be a good moral farmer. You know those cities? They're awful, immoral places. Stay away from them. So the idea in Jewish thought originates from this question of how can we live together? What would be the appropriate sort of social contract to govern this initial land-based community? And so for us, really what's important is the law. Now, eventually, of course, we're driven off of that land, right? The Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Greeks, right? It was just Hanukkah, right? The Romans, right? They move us away, but we were a temple-based religion. You can't take the temple with you, but what the priest did was write down the laws. We could take the book with us. And so in these periods of exile, where we couldn't be near the temple, the book became more important than the land. The book replaced the temple as the focus of the religion. And the question is, okay, where are you going to run to? Well, really, the only place if you're in exile that's going to take you in tend to be cities. The places we were warned to stay out of, now suddenly we're in. And the question is, okay, we're not going to give up these laws. We're not going to give up this way of being. But the question is, how can we adjust it so that following these rules fits a new urban lifestyle instead of the pastoral agrarian lifestyle? Now we've got to reinterpret. And so questions of interpretation of text become central to our tradition, right? That's where the Talmud comes from. So Jewish thought is really about law and interpreting law. How do these laws that we all accept fit in this weird lived context, which is unlike that lived context? And that's what the great rabbis do. It's about interpretation of law. And so that's really the heart of Jewish thought. Now, this differs from Greek thought. The Greeks have their city-states. Athens in particular becomes the world's first democracy. And what happens in a democracy, let's hope we can keep ours, is that you have different people make different arguments trying to convince the population. And so in the case of a democracy, what's important is rhetorical power, being able to convince other people, the search for truth. Who's right? Where's the truth? We'll all vote on it, but we have to hear the arguments. And so Greek thought is not about law. So Judaism, because we get the mitzvot from the Torah, starts with law and then is about interpretation of law. But the law is fundamental. For Greeks, truth is fundamental, and any sort of law will come out of the truth. So for Greeks, they're not considering the moral questions first and foremost. They're considering the truth question first, and then morality will come second out of it. So for Greek thought, it's really about what should I believe? Then we come to the Christians, right? Historically, the last of these groups. And Christianity really owes, even though it comes out of a band of Jews, it really owes its way of thinking much more to the Greeks. So Christian thought really focuses on this question of belief. But what they do is they move it from the Greek notion of reasonable belief, that for which I have arguments in support of, that which is likely the truth, and here's why. The Christians move it to a question of faith, right? That it's not about having reasons to believe the truth, it's simply accepting that our truth is the truth. And so you have three very, very different notions, right? For the Christians, the truth is hidden. Only God knows the truth. For Jews, well, we have the books. It's in there. Now, it may be hidden in there, and this is what great rabbis do, is they milk the text to get all of the insights out of it, right? And that's true whether you're a rationalist, right? Someone like Maimonides, who's going to say we need to just philosophically interpret the Torah to understand its deep meaning, as opposed to Kabbalists and other mystics who are going to say, no, 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 that's just the surface truth. There's a deeper truth hidden in these books, hidden in the words. If we rearrange the letters, if we change the letters into numerical values. But for Jews, we already have, the truth has been in a certain sense given to us. That's what the Torah is. So for Jews, we have the truth, we just have to figure it out. For the Christians, they don't yet have truth. They have the way, right? Jesus is the way. But the truth, in a certain sense, is hidden, and it's only along the path given by their faith where the truth will be revealed. And so for Christians, the notion of a prophet is one who reveals this divine truth that no other human has, right? The important thing for a Christian prophet is that they speak with God, and in speaking with God, God reveals to them some of the divine truth so that they can then take it back to people. So our notion of prophet tends to come, because we are in a Christian-dominated culture, from them, right? The idea is that the role of a prophet is to give us truth that we don't have, and by speaking with God, the Christian prophet reveals the truth. But for Jews, we already had it. So then the question is, why would this third book be taken up with prophets? Why do Jews need prophets if this whole notion of prophecy really is much more of a Christian concept? And the answer is that Jewish prophets are doing something radically different than Christian prophets. The Hebrew prophets had a very different role. So it is true that the Hebrew prophets spoke to God. That is part of prophecy. And they did say, and here's revealed what God is going to do possibly in the future. But what's really important about the Hebrew prophets is not that they spoke to God, but rather that they spoke for God. The Hebrew prophets are the mouth of God to tell something to the Jews. Now, it's not to reveal truth, right? We already have the truth in the Torah. What is it that the Hebrew prophets are doing? Well, what they're doing is telling us how angry God is. So God, like the rest of us Jews, can be a little passive aggressive, right? When we do things that don't make him happy, he doesn't come out and say, no, 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 it's fine, whatever, right? But then he's got a friend. We all have that friend we fetch to, right? Where we got to get something off of our chest, we have to vent, we have that friend we can call up, and we can just unload on them. That is what the Hebrew prophets are. So the Hebrew prophets are called to God when God looks down and sees widespread immorality. When what's happening on the earth is not to his moral liking. And then he picks a good person. He finds a good moral person and says, can you believe what they're doing down there? Look at all these horrible things they're doing to the vulnerable, to the poor, to the sick. That's just awful. That's not how I said to live. Now you go and tell them that if they don't shape up and fly right, I'm going to do these awful things. But if they go back to obeying the halakhic law, if they follow the mitzvahs, if they're good people, I'll send them some more milk and honey. And so the prophet then goes and spreads the word. Now, this is where our concept of tzedakah comes from. So tzedakah, we all think back to Hebrew school with the little cardboard boxes where you're supposed to put part of your allowance, and give it as charity. So we really do think of the concept of tzedakah as charity, which is, again, much more of a Christian notion. Tzedakah really comes out of this prophetic period. And it doesn't literally translate to charity. It actually means righteousness. It actually means justice. So tzedakah is the act of righting wrongs that you see with your eyes in front of you. Tzedakah is understanding that the world is unfair and understanding that as a Jew, you have an obligation to right that wrong. So the opposite of tzedakah would be, when you're walking down the street and you see a homeless person, and what do? You look away. You cross the street. Why? Because if you look that person in the face, you now realize that you understand their suffering and you're moved to do something. But you don't want to have to do anything. So if I don't see it, it doesn't exist. That's the opposite of tzedakah. So it's not merely, giving money to a charity, which is a wonderful thing. We should all contribute. But tzedakah is a deeper notion. It means seeing the injustices around you and fixing them, making the world a more fair, more moral, more just place. Now contrast that with, for example, the notion of tikkun olam, right, to heal the world. That's a much more sort of larger global understanding that, we need to do things that will create a better world for everyone, and that we're part of that, and we need to work together to heal the earth. Well, that's certainly also part of what we need to do, but notice the difference between tikkun olam and tzedakah. So tikkun olam, there used to be lots of bumper stickers around, think globally, act locally. That's the distinction here. What the prophets were saying is tzedakah, act locally. Tikkun olam says think globally. And yes, as Jews, we're called to do both. But what the prophets were doing is really dealing with the local. They were pointing out, especially in Jewish communities, when we were messing up. And we're God's chosen people. If we mess up, that's a really bad thing, because we not only risk losing God's favor, but we're supposed to be the people who have the rules. We're supposed to be the ones who live the proper way. Now, the best book for understanding the Hebrew prophets is this one. It's Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's book of the prophets. It's a hefty book, as you can see. And he goes through each of the prophets explaining what they were really called to do. But what's really interesting in this book is that he says in all of the cases, for all of the prophetic literature, it really comes with a structure. There are 4 things that all of our prophets do. The first thing is they have to tell you they're a prophet, right? So they have to disclose that they are in communication with God. Now notice the person that God often picks as a prophet is just a, normal, nice, working sort of person. Now, we had a structure. There was a high priest who was supposed to be the one to talk to God. And now suddenly God's just talking to some schmo. So the first thing that the prophet had to do was convince others that, I'm really who I say I am. And then has to explain why God felt the need to come to him. And they were all men, right? And the idea is, look, here are the things you are doing. Here are the things that are displeasing God. And then the third thing is, if you don't fix this, here are the awful things he will do. Now, the last thing that the prophet does is say, none of us want that. So if you fix it, if you start acting the way Jews are supposed to act, it's all going to be wonderful. So he first presents the stick, he then presents the carrot. And that, Heschel, is what he says is the form of all of the Jewish prophetic literature. That's what all of the prophets do, right? They're not disclosing new knowledge. They're simply telling us God's demand that we straighten up and fly right. And so prophetic Judaism is all about speaking to the powerful for the sake of the vulnerable. It's about protecting the needy who are being abused, and abused in some cases by us, right? We are called upon in order to act well, to act right. But we're humans. We don't always do so. And what the prophets tell us, there are consequences for our actions. Now, what's interesting is that this book of Heschel's, while it's well known amongst Jewish scholars, its historical greatest impact was not on Jews. The people who really were the most affected by Heschel's writings were those Black American Christians who were leading the civil rights movement. So Heschel met Martin Luther King Jr. at a conference, and they were speaking back to back. And Heschel went on first, and King was like, wow, this is a moral, brilliant man. And then King went on, and Heschel's like, boy, I'm glad I didn't have to follow that. And after they both spoke, they just shared a deep mutual admiration. King refers often to Heschel's book, and Heschel can be seen in many historical pictures, marching literally arm in arm at the front of some of these marches at Selma, literally arm in arm with Martin Luther King Jr. Now, a number of these protests were held on Saturday, and other rabbis criticized him for marching on the Shabbos. And his response was, I was praying with my feet. So the American civil rights movement, Heschel did see in Judaic terms, in prophetic Jewish terms, that I can see a wrong that is in front of me, and I am thereby called to correct it. That was tzedakah. So let's get into one of these prophets. Let's talk about the prophet Amos, in part because he's very interesting, and in part because alphabetically he comes first. So Amos lived about the mid-8th century BCE. This was a time when there were actually two Jewish kingdoms in the Middle East. There was the southern kingdom of Judah, and this is where Jerusalem is, the temple is, and it was ruled by the king Uzziah. And then there was a second Jewish kingdom, and this was the northern kingdom that was called Israel. It was ruled by Jeroboam II. And at the time, the northern kingdom was much wealthier. Jeroboam was actually a very clever military strategist. Under his rule, the kingdom of Israel expanded to include parts of what are now Syria and Lebanon. So he was able to take over land, acquire all sorts of wealth. And so the northern kingdom of Israel was really sort of the financial hotspot. It was just booming. Life there was wonderful. Amos was a common farmer. It often says he was a fig dresser, whatever that means, from the poor South. And so he really was a common person. He's somebody that especially the Northerners would look down on. The split in those days between the Northern and Southern Kingdom is actually not terribly different from, say, the East Coast, where, compare the Northern Kingdom is like Darien, Connecticut, right? The Southern Kingdom's like Alabama. And so what do we have? We have a farmer from Alabama who says God is talking to him. And what does God say to him? He says, okay, I am unhappy. And Amos says, you're God. What do you have to be unhappy about? And God says, oi, let me tell you. Let's start with the Goyim. You wouldn't believe what they're doing. And he goes through the non-Jewish nations and he outlines the horrible things they're doing. Oi, says Amos, we got to be better than that. It's like, I haven't told you. And so then he goes to Judah and he says, here's what the people in the south, your people, are doing. That doesn't make me happy either. He says, well, what about the rich people up north? He says, them I really got a problem with. And so he outlines, and this is all in the book of Amos, what they were doing. And it was the northerners for which those who were in the kingdom of Israel that he has his harshest words for. He says, these people, he says, you've got judges, right? What is a judge supposed to be? A judge is supposed to be someone who brings justice. Justice, and Judaism is really where this notion of equal justice under the law comes from. These judges are crooked. What are they doing? They're doing favors for their rich friends, right? The powerful who made them judges, and they're taking bribes from the poor. What don't the poor have? Money. And what are they doing? They're taking the little they have. How horrible is that? I mean, it's always awful to harm the vulnerable, but when you are in the position to defend justice, and instead of that, you're perpetuating injustice against those who are already victims, he was just furious. Is that all? No. Let me tell you about these rich women. At one point, he refers to them as cows. He says, they lounge about all day, demanding of their servants, bring me more wine. They're just sitting there eating and drinking. Oh, that's awful. And their husbands, oh, their husbands. These are people who should be working for a better world. Instead, what are they doing? They're building these beautiful homes covered in ivory. They're building all of these fancy things. They claim to be worshiping God, but they do so in a way that is ostentatious, right? The idea here is they're simply wedded to status symbols. God says, that's not what I want. What I want is actual obeying of the law. And here's where he turns on the last group, the priests. Now you'd think, wait a minute, the priests are going to be the most religious of all. And what God says to Amos is that what they've done is completely perverted the heart of Judaism. Judaism is not about ritual. It's not about how much you can show you care about the religion. It's not, how flashy you can be in showing everyone how devout you are. It's in living the right way. And what's happened amongst the priests and amongst those who claim to be the most religious is really, they've taken Judaism and made it about them. It's been about their image, about seeming pious, instead of actually doing what my laws command, which is living a good life, being a good person. Now, needless to say, the high priest and the others in power were not very happy to hear this, right? The high priest was, right, the great connection to the divine. And here's this person saying, no, I'm actually holier than the high priest, and I'm just a little schmo, a little nebbish, a nothing. And has the temerity to challenge the high priest, to say that God doesn't like what the high priest is doing. So needless to say, these prophets in their time were deeply unpopular. He then says, listen to me, don't listen to me, it's up to you. But if you don't listen to me, he says, earthquakes, fire from the sky that will destroy both kingdoms. God is so angry, he's going to rip up our insurance policy, right? The agreement that makes us the chosen people. But if you do follow, good things will happen. Now, it's not long after these prophecies that what actually happens in the area? An earthquake. So it certainly seemed to many as if the prophecy seemed to be coming true, and hopefully woke up some in the area. So here's just a couple of excerpts from the book of Amos. Some may seem familiar to you, right? Because you trample on the poor and take from him extractions of wheat. You have built houses of hewn stone, but you shall not dwell in them. You've planted pleasant vineyards, but you shall not drink wine thereof. For I know how manifold are your transgressions and how mighty are your sins. You that afflict the just, that take a ransom, that turn aside the needy at the gate. Therefore, the prudent doth keep silence in such a time, for it is an evil time. And he says to those who claim, who profess, their Judaism, who say, look at me, I'm super Jew. He says of them, this is God speaking, I despise your feasts, and I will take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Yea, though you offer me burnt offerings and your meal offerings, I will not accept them. Neither will I regard the peace offerings of your fat beasts. Take thou away from me the noise of thy songs. Let me not hear the melody of thy psalteries, right? Don't sing the hymns. Don't give me your prayers. I don't want those. But, he says, let justice well up as waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. And those are words you might remember from Martin Luther King Jr. This is where King is getting much of his language from the prophets. And the prophet Amos is one of those he was deeply, deeply moved by. So let's then switch tracks. Let's move into the 20th century. Let's talk about Albert Einstein. So who's Einstein? Well, he was born 2,600 years after Amos in 1888 in Ulm, Germany on March 14th, so Pi Day. And he was born into a secular family, a very secular family, a family so secular that they actually sent him to Catholic school. Back in those days, it was, not unusual for Jewish families to be very secular. It was the sort of birth of modernism that held great hope for Jews, right? Because all of Europe, of course, had these deeply anti-Semitic histories, all sorts of laws banning Jews from that which would lead to human flourishing. And then there's this movement starting in the 17th century, but really accelerating through the 19th, called the Enlightenment. And in it, right, this is where our modern democratic theory comes from, right? All human beings, by virtue of being rational, are equal, right? Human equivalence leads to democracy, right? Leads to the ability of anyone to have the, opportunity to pursue life, liberty, right? And happiness. And so Jews saw this modernism as their ticket to political emancipation. Now, there is, of course, in the Jewish community, a debate about this, right? In Europe, especially in Central Europe, in Germany, where there were those, and this was a movement called the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, who said, okay, we need to look at traditional Judaism as this sort of ancient set of doctrine that may have made sense thousands of years ago, but in this modern world, it needs to be changed, it needs to be updated, it needs to be reformulated. This is where Reform Judaism comes from. It was in that challenge of changing Judaism to meet the challenges and the needs of the modern world that a group said, harumph, don't change anything. And this is where orthodoxy comes from. So orthodoxy comes as a response to reform. And then we're Jews. There can't be two sides of any argument. You have the reform, you have the orthodox. Okay, we're going to split the middle. And then the last one to emerge is conservative Judaism. But the point is that for many, especially more urban Jews, this modernism, this worldview that has a democratic foundation and a commitment to science, these sorts of things were wonderful because if they're true, then the anti-Semitism has no foundation. If we cling to this new scientific modern point of view, we undermine their ability to shut us out of the society. We use their own sort of philosophy against them. And that was the sort of house that Einstein grew up in. His father was very much a modernist. Now, at the same time, in Germany, it was mandated that all schooling include a religious component. And so Einstein, by being sent to a Catholic school, Peterschule or St. Peter's Academy, was therefore having to take lessons in Catholic theology, the catechism. And while his parents were secular, that was a little bit too far. So what they did is they brought in a religious uncle, and once a week, he got one-on-one tutoring. He basically got personal Hebrew school from his uncle. And at age 9, it took. At age 9, Einstein became an observant practicing Jew. He would sing psalms to himself on the walk to school. He would try to keep kosher, which of course was very hard at a German house where every meal sort of featured sausage. But at age 9, Einstein declared himself Jewish, right? And this was a very Einstein thing to do. Einstein had a personality. Einstein was the sort of person where if you had any authority, his thumb was going for your eye. So at home, he has his parents who are not only not religious, but anti-religious. Then at school, he is the Jewish kid. So if we want to rebel and kill two birds with one stone, he can do so by actually becoming the Jewish kid. And at age 9, he becomes very religious. And then at age 10, he changes. And he changes for a couple of reasons. There were two things that actually undermined Einstein's Judaism. The first one is the reading of Talmud. Now, not the writings of the ancient rabbis, but Max Talmud, who was a medical student at the time. It was a standard practice amongst Jews that once a week you were to take in a local student and feed them. Because then, like now, students didn't have a lot of money, needed a good home-cooked meal. And so the Einstein family once a week would have Max Talmud over for dinner. Now, he was a poor med student, but he wanted to get in good with the parents. So what do? You make nice to the kid. So he would pick up at the time there in Germany, it was all the rage, these small paperback popular science books. So he'd spend a Deutschmark, he'd buy one of these little books, he'd give it to young Albert. Then while dinner was being made or while the dishes were being cleared, Albert would just go through it and they'd had these talks about science that just lit Albert up. And one of these books, which was a book on Euclidean geometry, just completely blew his mind. For Einstein, Euclidean geometry was unbelievable. Why? Well, think back to high school. Think back to geometry, right? What did you do lots of? Proofs. What's a proof? It's a deductive argument where you start from initial absolutely certain truths and then with absolute certainty logically derive weird, complex, counterintuitive results. And so in this book, what Einstein saw was that the human mind itself was enough to understand the nature of space, right? Because that's what geometry is about. It's the laws of space. And the laws of space are necessarily true. And I don't need an authority. I just need logic. And so that completely transformed his worldview. Now he doesn't need any authorities, teachers, rabbis, the government. No authority needed. All I need is my own brain to understand the workings of the world. Now I have to understand when he's growing up. Germany had just become a country 8 years before Einstein was born, right? Bismarck unites all of they were disparate regions and free cities, and under von Bismarck, it becomes a single unified Germany. And when nations begin, there's hyper-patriotism, nationalism, which is also often tied to militarism. And so there were frequent military parades that would go through the streets. And Einstein saw all the noise and the people walking in, marching in exact unison. And it just bothered him to the core of his being. Anything having to do with the military to him just seemed contrary to what it is to be a human being. And so he develops a lifelong distrust of anything military and a deep disgust for war. So he goes off to high school. He's doing fine. It's a myth that Einstein failed math. Einstein was getting top marks, and we know this from two pieces of evidence. The first is we have his report cards. The second is we have letters from his mother to his grandmother. Now, if your son is doing very, very well in math, what are you doing? You're kvelling, right? You're bragging. And we've got the letters of Einstein's mother bragging to the grandmother. So we know Einstein was actually doing very well in school. But he hated it. He hated the German schooling because he thought it killed the humanity. It was mostly memorization. And he thought that's actually destroying the real power of the human mind. So he ultimately finishes, goes to college at the Federal Institute of Technology, the MIT of Switzerland, graduates, can't get a job. Now, there's a lot more to the story we could talk about later, but cannot get a job anywhere. Literally applies to every single scientist in all of Europe, cannot get a position as an assistant. Part of it was he got top grades, but he wasn't a good student. How do you get good grades if you're not a good student? Well, he's Einstein. He thought he knew better. So he wouldn't go to class. I don't need this. They're teaching old stuff. I want to know the new stuff. So he would get the journals out of the library and go to a coffee house and read by himself. Well, the professors think this guy's a goof off. And so he gets lousy recommendations, gets no offers. He's got a friend whose father has some contacts, gets him a job as a lowly patent clerk. So he's in Bern, Switzerland. At this point, he's married. He's got a 1-year-old child. The marriage is dysfunctional. They're arguing. The kid is crying. He's working 6 days a week. And yet somehow, in 1905, he writes 5 scientific papers. And those would go on to change the world. 2 of those papers, the last 2, are his theory of special relativity, which completely reformulates what we mean by time, space, mass, and energy, the fundamental notions of the universe. And at first, not many people buy it. It's so weird, and nobody knows who this guy is. But ultimately, it catches on. He then realizes he's got a problem with the theory. And again, we can talk about this in more detail later if you're interested. And he realizes the theory is too limited. It only covers the special case of straight line constant speed motion. The real laws of nature should be universal, and so he tries to generalize them, and that's the general theory of relativity, which he then publishes 11 years later in 1916. 3 years after that, Eddington gives us the first evidence, the first confirmation that the theory is actually true. And it's then, at the end of World War I, that Einstein became the scientist celebrity that we know. Now, in Germany, he was viewed very differently. Because 1919 is right after World War I. As a pacifist, he objected to World War I vocally, publicly, and he was hated for it. Think about Jane Fonda during Vietnam. That's how Einstein was thought of in Germany, as a traitor, as somebody who's giving comfort to the enemy, because Germany thought this was the war that was going to establish Germany as the great world power. How dare Einstein oppose the war? And all of Germany was united. And here was virtually this lone voice. Einstein referred to himself as an Einspanner, a lone horse, right? When you have just a single horse pulling a cart in its own direction. And so you have Einstein, the pacifist, who is reviled by the conservatives in Germany for standing up for peace instead of the war that was going to establish German greatness. But that sort of gives us the sense of the moral core of this person. And that's where we're going to want to connect Einstein with Amos. So again, remember, we drew this distinction between tikkun olam, thinking globally, and tzedakah, acting locally. And what we'll see is Einstein, who certainly had his moral flaws, especially if you were married to him, right? But what he did do is realize that what his science gave him was a platform, and that he had an obligation to use that platform to make the world a better place. At one point, because he was so famous as a result of his physics, he writes to a friend of his that he has a version of the Midas touch, but instead of everything turning to gold, everything he says turns into newsprint. He realizes that no matter what he says, it's going to get printed in a newspaper. And so what he realizes is that's a power I can use for good. And so during World War I, he's a voice for peace. After, he's a voice for economic justice. He writes a book, an article called Why Socialism? Now you have to remember, socialism and communism are different things. He says Marxist communism isn't right. They're trying to say it's the scientific theory. It isn't. Capitalism, on the other hand, he argues, can turn predatory. We need a middle path, something in between, where, unlike the Marxists, we don't give up private property, but we control the economy in such a way that we don't allow the poor to become poorer. He saw the beginning of this sort of rich getting richer, poor getting poorer, and saw that this is inherently morally problematic, that we need to restructure the economy so that it's fair to all. So he's looking after the economically vulnerable. Now, he, of course, launches the nuclear age, both scientifically with his equation E equals mc squared, but also in the letter that he writes to Roosevelt that really is sort of the straw that started the Manhattan Project. And he was worried, of course, that the Germans were going to create the bomb first. But then once he saw what happened with the bomb, once Hitler was defeated and he saw these bombs used against Japan, he became one of the loudest voices in the world opposing nuclear proliferation and the development of new, larger bombs. He used his place as an activist for what he thought was peaceful, sensible uses of atomic energy. Atoms for Peace was the slogan of the group he fronted. And finally, he was a significant anti-racist voice. He writes a piece called The Negro Question, which is meant to echo the European phrase, the Jewish question, right? In Germany, he saw Jews as this oppressed outside group that the mainstream was always looking to denigrate. He then comes to America, first out to California. He then moves to Princeton, New Jersey, and Princeton is seen as sort of the northernmost southern town. Princeton, a very racist place, and his home on Mercer Street was actually right at the edge of the local African-American neighborhood. And so his walk to work took him through the Black neighborhoods. And so they'd see this old guy with funny hair walking by, and he became friendly and acquainted with the lives of these people, seeing the difference between white Princeton and Black Princeton, and became a vocal advocate against racism. But we said there was a difference between Tikkun Olam and tzedakah. So he clearly used his fame in this large way, using the megaphone to broadcast. But what did he do locally? Well, one of the things he did in World War II, in order to get your relatives brought over from Europe to America, you had to have a sponsor. You had to have somebody write a letter saying that this was a good person. This is a person who would benefit the United States to have here. Every single person who contacted Einstein for a letter, whether he knew the person or not, he would write a letter in support, knowing that his fame, his name would help get this person out of Europe. At one point, he joked to a friend that he was running a one-man immigration service. He wrote so many of these letters every single day. But he also did other things locally. And this is one of my favorite Einstein stories, is when he would walk home from work. So he was at the Institute for Advanced Study, which is not Princeton University. It's a separate institution established by a Jewish charity run by a man named Bamberger, funded by Bamberger. And it was designed just for, the world's smartest people to just go and do smart things. And so he would walk from the institute home. He didn't drive. And as he would walk home from work every day, he would see this little African-American girl, about 8 years old, on the front porch doing her homework. And inevitably, she was stuck on her math. So he would sit there and they worked out a trade. This old German guy who just walked by the house, she had no idea who this guy was, would help her with her math homework, and she would give him gumdrops. It wasn't until years later that she realized that her math homework, her math tutor, happened to be the world's smartest person. And so with that, let's stop the share and open it up to questions and conversation.
Yes, Professor, can you
Feel
hear
free
me?
to call me Steve.
That was really, you covered a lot of ground, incredibly informative. It seems from what you're saying, Einstein was the first great woke person. He would have been very happy to be marching with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren today, yes?
I think that's fair. He may have been even to the left of Bernie. So, yeah, well, democratic socialism probably does capture his view. So, Elizabeth Warren says, I am a capitalist. Bernie says I'm, a democratic socialist, whether that's a hair to be split, but certainly what both of them are advocating in terms of a healthier economic structure that still keeps private property, still keeps the ability to have a business, but organizes the economy in such a way that it's more fair, that it elevates the vulnerable, that opposes racism. In that sense, I think, yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if Einstein would be a Bernie or a Warren supporter.
One other question. Let's get back to Amos. Since we don't have prophets today, if we projected Amos into the current age, and we do live in a world of dispute and evil to a great degree, would he claim that perhaps the COVID was God's answer to the intransigence of mankind today?
I don't know if he'd point to COVID, but I think the place he might point is global warming. Because if you look at what's being predicted, look, if we don't care about each other and about the planet, what's going to happen? Floods, hurricanes, cold snaps. All of these actually seem a whole lot like the sorts of things that the prophets were prophesying. And we're now seeing climate scientists say the same sort of things are coming if we don't act right. But if we reduce our carbon footprint, so you're right. We in a certain sense don't have prophets in the traditional sense, but it seems as if in a certain sense we might still have prophets, people asking us to behave better towards each other, because if we don't, awful things could happen. But if we do, life could be okay.
I think we really appreciate all of the thoughts you gave us today. They made me think a lot about things. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Fantastic, Steve. It was unbelievable. Wow. That was a lot of talking, very comprehensive. Does anyone else have questions?
I just really wanted to use the title.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Steve,
Well, one last thing in, Claudia.
Steve, could you speak with about Einstein's amount of how religious was he when he came to this country, and did he belong to a temple? Was he involved in the Jewish community? Because we never hear much about that.
So Einstein, it's fascinating. He was asked by a rabbi, do you believe in God? And his response was, I believe in the God of Spinoza. So Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza, was a 17th century Sephardic Jewish philosopher who lived in Amsterdam. And Spinoza got himself excommunicated from the synagogue for being a pantheist. What Spinoza argued is that the universe is a well-ordered place, that a perfect God would create a perfect universe. And therefore that perfection, in a certain sense, would be more powerful than God. And that's, so for him as a pantheist, he said, God isn't separate from the world is the divine. And in the same way, what Einstein believed, he says, I don't believe in a personal God. That is, I don't believe that God has a human-like form, has a mind, has a will. For Einstein, the notion of God was the perfect physics textbook. So if you think of God as he who governs the universe, physics is the set of laws that do what? Govern the universe. And so in his work as a physicist, he said, I'm trying to read the mind of God. That is, I'm trying to understand the structure by which the universe operates. So he's not going to say there is a separate being that is God with a will, but there is an order to the universe. Now, at the same time, he does, after about 1930, so before 1930, he gives up any sense of a Jewish identity. What's interesting is after 1930, he starts addressing Jewish groups using the pronouns we and us. And my book, Julie? Einstein, His Space and Times, is the story of exactly that. How does Einstein and why does Einstein reclaim his Jewish identity? And there are a couple of reasons why. And for him, he is a secular Jew, so he does not belong to a synagogue, but he does consider himself Jewish after the 1930s. And so for him, Judaism, his Jewishness is really, he says it's two things. One is a sense of awe in looking at the universe. And the second is an ethic based on empathy. Now, this isn't a famous talk he gave, a public address, and I'd always wondered, why those two things? right? Not all Jews have them and plenty of non-Jews. Why those? And it was in researching this book that all of a sudden I realized the answer, which is at the time that he gives that speech, one of his best friends is Martin Buber. And here he is having dinner with Buber, right? Who is the anti-modernist rabbi, and they're dear friends. And he's wondering what makes us both Jews. We're so different. Everything we believe is different. Everything we practice is different. And the answer tends to be those two things. Those two things actually connect to Buber's two great books. So the first is about the joys of the Hasidim, right? They dance and sing, delighting in the great mystery. And Einstein says, oh, well, that's actually what I do as a physicist. And the second, of course, is I and Thou, which is his version of Jewish existentialism. And Einstein's ethic is very much similar. And so he's connected to a Jewish world, but he isn't, after age 9, a practicing Jew.
Fascinating. Thank you very much.
And again, if you're interested, it is available through booksellers everywhere because I have 2 kids I'm putting through college.
All right, Steve, thank you so much. I do have a recording. If anyone's interested, let me know. Just send me an email. And thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon. And we will see you again next week. Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye-bye.